Only Faye Dunaway has the talent and the class and the courage it takes to make a real star. I did not know Judy Garland well, but after watching her in action a few times, I didn't want to know her well. There were times when I felt sorry for Judy, but there were more times when I thought, for Christ's sakes, get off your ass. These quotes are alleged to have been said by Joan Crawford herself. They've been repeated for decades, but there's just one problem. There's no evidence she ever said them. Picture this. It's 1981, and in a few months the film Mommy Dearest is about to be released. Public interest in Joan Crawford was at an all-time high, and her image was being debated everywhere. Other people are writing books about her life. Why not release one yourself? In Roy Newquist's book Conversations with Crawford, he claims he sat down with Joan Crawford over 20 times, conducting in-depth conversations about her life and career. But years later, in 2023, Roy's own family came forward calling him a liar, con artist, and even suggested that he may have never even interviewed Joan Crawford at all.
Here's Tony Guided to take us to 7 o'clock. Tony?
Thank you, Chuck. Good evening to you. Joan Crawford, who rose from a chorus girl to one of the top stars of the golden age of movies, died today of a heart attack at her Manhattan home.
In May of 1977, Joan Crawford passed away from a heart attack related to pancreatic cancer. A year later, in November of 1978, her eldest adopted daughter, Christina Crawford, published her infamous memoir, Mommy Dearest. Then in July of 1981, Roy published his own book, Conversations with Joan Crawford, claiming it was based on personal interviews he had with Joan over the years. The release came just 2 months before the film adaptation of Mommy Dearest starring Faye Dunaway.
It's wonderful!
By 1981, only 4 years after Joan's death, 3 biographies, not including the book by Roy Newquist, had already been published about Joan. One of the books that was released, called Joan Crawford, the Raging Star by Charles Castle, even claimed to be authorized, but Crawford's estate had that claim removed off the book. So who was Roy Newquist, and why did he write this book? Well, this is complicated. Even something as basic as his identity doesn't fully line up. So according to his own resume from 1985 and his partner Ken Lapointe, he was born on July 14th in 1929 in Quebec, Canada. But throughout his other personal and professional life, he claimed he was born in Wisconsin on July 25th, 1925. He told this version to his own family. Even on his daughter's birth certificate, his birthplace is listed as Ashland, Wisconsin. I was able to find a 1930 census from Ashland, which listed Roy as being born in 1925 to Arvid and Faye Newquist. His father is recorded as a traveling salesman. What's interesting is that the census lists his mother's birthplace as Canada, which could explain where Roy later got that version of his story for himself. So even in official records, the details start to change, and that's not where the inconsistencies end for Roy. Growing up, he always wanted to be a writer, and he studied journalism either at Marquette University or the University of Wisconsin, depending on which version of his story you believe he was born in. He also claims that both he didn't complete his degree and that he did complete his degree, going on to earn a master's. As an adult, Roy worked in advertising before eventually becoming a book critic in the early 1960s. In 1968, he left his wife and 3 children in the Midwest and moved to Los Angeles, where he began publishing interviews while chasing his goal of ultimately writing a successful novel or a screenplay. He also did in fact interview celebrities like the likes of Myrna Loy.
What did you do? How did you feel about not being active? I mean,
Well, I was active.
I meant not active as far as the motion picture or stage
But I
career.
was, you see, that's the thing.
But Roy had serious money problems. He promised people money he didn't have, borrowed and never repaid it, and even wrote checks he knew would bounce. So even his personal life seems to shift depending on how it's told. After Roy left his wife, he eventually lived with his partner Ken Lapointe for years while publicly insisting that he was straight. He remained in Los Angeles with Ken until his death in 1997 at either age 68 or 72, depending on which birth year is true. So, depending on the story, you're looking at a different person every time. And I think the clearest way to understand him comes from his own granddaughter, Brianna McKenna. She said, in every encounter with Roy, he puts forth a version of himself he wanted you to see. Roy was a writer, an interviewer, a gay man, a family man, an alcoholic, a liar, a friend of Hollywood. He was always in debt, always late, always almost done, always almost famous. He was all of these things, but he was none of these things. It depended on the day. When you step back and look at all of this together, his shifting birthplace, his conflicting education, his financial issues, his dream of a successful novel or screenplay, and the contradictions in his personal life, you start to see a pattern. Not just of the inconsistencies, but of someone who constantly rewrote his own and others' stories. So, what is the issue with Conversations with Crawford? Well, Roy claimed he first met Joan Crawford in 1962 at an autograph event for her book, A Portrait of Joan, in New York. And over the next 15 years, they met 21 times and had 33 telephone calls, however, none of which were recorded or photographed. Betty Barker, Crawford's secretary from 1955 until her death in 1977, said that she had no record of any appointment with Roy on Joan's calendars. Also, longtime Crawford historian behind the concluding chapter of Crawford website found that Roy's name does not appear anywhere in Joan's large telephone directories from the 1960s to 1970s, which contained the contact information of anyone she ever spoke with. And Roy's own granddaughter, Bri McKenna, said this in 2023, quote, "There's good evidence that Roy never spoke with Joan Crawford before publishing a book exclusively composed of interviews with her. My grandmother, Roy's wife, never knew of them talking. There is no tapes of Roy interviewing Crawford. Roy's address book doesn't have Crawford's information, and Crawford's doesn't have Roy's. While people familiar with Crawford say that Roy nailed her voice in the supposed interviews, none of the information in the book is anything that couldn't be found elsewhere at the time. His granddaughter has also only been able to prove that he met about half of the people he claims to have actually written about. Another thing that's especially suspicious is that Roy usually recorded his interviews via audio, which actually includes over 500 hours in the archive of the UCLA, which you can listen to. But there is not a single recording of him interviewing Joan Crawford. But this was one of his most successful books. He claimed that all interviews done with Joan were done in shorthand during their visits. Yet, if some were conducted over the phone, those would have been easy to record, right? Conversations with Crawford isn't the only time Roy's credibility has been questioned. Also back in October of 1967, he published a book called Chuck, an Experience, under the name Carl Sterland. This is suspected to avoid harming his wife. He claimed that he had discovered a long-lost son in Los Angeles and became deeply unraveled in his life. During this time, according to Roy's granddaughter, Roy allegedly cheated on his wife, helped Chuck smuggle and use drugs, and further fell into debt. It is also alleged that Chuck actually could have been Roy's lover instead of son. So you see, what's interesting about Roy is that his books appear to contain both truths and lies. His granddaughter confirmed that Chuck was in fact a real person that her family talked about, but elements in the story he wrote about contradict themselves in the recordings held at the UCLA. So for example, in one recording, Roy and Chuck can be heard discussing the book and whether certain parts of it are actually believable. Also in the book, Chuck describes being abused by an older woman, but on the audio tape, he admits it was actually an abusive relationship with a man. So, what do I think about this? Maybe Roy did meet Joan, but he happened to just bump into her at a few events and was able to ask her a few short questions. The normal interaction you would expect from a journalist or reporter on a red carpet or something. But in 1977, after Joan's death, he saw an opportunity. Her image was being questioned in the public already, especially after Christina released her memoir, Mommy Dearest. And 4 other people had already published books by the time he did. So to sum it all up, Roy has no audio recordings of Joan in the 500 plus hours in the UCLA archives. He has no record of meeting Joan on either his or Crawford's calendars, and there is no trace of him in her telephone directories or his. At the same time, he was in significant debt and was searching to write a successful book or screenplay. And yet, sadly, this didn't stop that version of Joan Crawford in his book from becoming facts, even used as source material in recent biographies such as Ferocious Ambition, Joan Crawford's March to Stardom by Robert Dance. So after a while, even if there's no proof, these things can just become facts, whether they're true or not. Once something is presented as a direct quote, it can also carry more weight. And when it fits what people are already hearing, it doesn't get questioned. Therefore, if these quotes aren't real, then they don't just misrepresent who Joan Crawford was, but they became her voice. So that leaves one final question. How much of the Joan Crawford we think we know was never real at all?